The heavy oak doors groaned open, a sound of protest swallowed by the organ's solemn hymn. Sunlight, fractured by stained glass, fell in jeweled patterns across the stone floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sacred air. At the altar, a man stood waiting, his back a rigid line of black silk. Every head in the pews was turned toward him, a silent congregation bearing witness to the union of two dynasties. But the sound that cut through the reverence was not the bride's procession. It was the frantic, slapping sound of worn-out sneakers on stone and the ragged gasp of a woman who had run until her lungs burned. Delilah burst through the entrance, her large frame heaving, the light pink fabric of her waitress uniform clinging to her skin. Her name tag, reading Delilah in cheerful blue script, was askew on her chest, and her white apron, a map of coffee spills and grease stains from a long shift, was a stark sacrilege in this pristine place. She saw him, the man at the altar, a figure of impossible stillness in a room electric with anticipation. She did not know his name was Kaito Ishikawa. She did not know he was the head of the Ishikawa Gumi, a man whose quietest whisper could unravel a dozen lives. She only knew he was the man from the newspaper photograph, the one the men in the corner booth had spoken of with such casual venom. Without a thought for the 100 pairs of eyes turning toward her, for the sudden halt of the music, for the guards in sharp suits whose hands were already moving inside their jackets, she ran. She ran down the long aisle, her breath a painful sob. "Stop," she gasped, her voice raw and loud in the sudden, echoing silence. "You have to get out. You have to get out now." She reached the altar and did the one thing no one in the city would have dared to do. She grabbed his arm, her fingers sinking into the expensive fabric of his tuxedo. The man, Kaito, turned his head slowly. His face was a mask of cold control, but his eyes, dark and deep, held a flicker of profound shock. He looked down at the hand on his arm, a hand with chipped nail polish and a faint scent of diner coffee, then up at the woman's terrified, pleading face. What he did not know was that this interruption, this violation of his most public and vulnerable moment, was not an attack. It was the only thing saving his life. If you are new here, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. We tell stories about the moments that change everything. Now, let us get back to the story of a promise made in the shadow of death. It had started 3 hours earlier, in the clatter and hiss of the Morning Glory diner. Delilah was on her feet for the 10th straight hour, a familiar ache settling deep into her bones. The rent was due, her landlord was a man with no patience, and the tips from the breakfast rush had barely covered the cost of her bus fare. She moved between tables with an economy of motion born of long practice, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, offering a tired but genuine smile. In the corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl that nobody liked, sat 2 men. They had been there for hours, nursing the same 2 cups of black coffee, speaking in low, clipped tones. Delilah had paid them little mind at first. They were just more faces in a long, wearying day. But as she wiped down the adjacent table, their words began to slice through the diner's ambient noise. One man, thin and wiry with a nervous tick in his eye, traced the rim of his cup. "The package is in place. Under the 3rd pew left side. The organ prelude is the trigger. Once the bride reaches the altar, the music swells, and then he made a soft, explosive sound with his lips." The other man, heavier and impassive, simply nodded. "The boss wants no mistakes. This wedding is supposed to be a truce. An insult like this, it guarantees war." "A war we're prepared for." Delilah froze, the damp rag in her hand suddenly cold against her skin. She kept her back to them, pretending to scrub a stubborn spot on the laminate. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. They were talking about the wedding. The one all over the news, the joining of the city's Japanese and Korean underworld families. A public display of peace. And these men were talking about a bomb. "Ishikawa won't know what hit him," the first man said, a grim smile touching his lips. "And the Korean girl with him, collateral. It will look like a betrayal from her side." "Perfect, Ishikawa." The name resonated. Kaito Ishikawa. She had seen his picture. A face that was both handsome and severe, a man who looked like he had never smiled in his life. He was marrying the daughter of the Park family. Delilah's mind raced. Call the police. But what would she say? That she overheard something in a diner? They would think she was a crank. They would take statements, file reports, and by the time they acted, it would be too late. The men stood up, dropping a few crumpled bills on the table. They walked past her without a glance, their conversation dissolving into murmurs about payment and a clean exit. Delilah stood paralyzed for a moment, the sounds of the diner fading into a dull roar in her ears. She looked at the clock on the wall. The wedding was in less than an hour. She could do nothing. She could go home, lock her door, and pretend she heard nothing. It was not her world. It was not her problem. But then she pictured the church, the people inside, the bride in her white dress. She thought of a life, any life, being extinguished because she was too afraid to act. Her own life was a daily struggle, a quiet grind of just getting by. But it was a life. She untied her apron, her hands shaking slightly, and let it fall onto a chair. She ran out the door, not toward the bus stop that would take her home, but in the opposite direction, toward the grand spires of the old cathedral downtown. Back in the hushed, tense atmosphere of the cathedral, Kaito Ishikawa stared at Delilah. His guards, 3 of them now, had formed a tight circle around them, their bodies poised to act. The bride, a young woman named Minesio Park, whose face was pale beneath a delicate veil, took a hesitant step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Kaito's gaze was analytical, cold. He was a man who read people for a living, who dissected motive and intent from the slightest flicker of an eye or the tremor in a voice. He saw a woman in a cheap uniform, out of breath, and clearly terrified. Her fear seemed genuine, not the manufactured panic of an assassin or a zealot. It was the fear of an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation. "Who are you?" His voice was low, perfectly controlled, yet it carried an authority that cut through the silence. One of his men, a sharp-faced lieutenant named Jinho, stepped forward. "Sir, let us remove her. She is clearly unwell." "This is an embarrassment." Jinho reached for Delilah's arm, but Kaito raised a single, cautionary finger. The lieutenant stopped instantly. Kaito's eyes never left Delilah's. "I will ask you again," he said, his tone dropping even lower. "Who are you?" "My name is Delilah," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I work at the Morning Glory Diner down on 5th. It doesn't matter. There's a bomb. In the church." They said when the organ swells," she was babbling, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate sincerity. She looked past him, at the rows of elegantly dressed guests, at the flowers, at the sunlight pouring through the windows. It was all so beautiful, and all of it was about to be torn apart. "Please," she whispered, her grip on his arm tightening without her realizing it. "You have to believe me. They're going to kill you," Jinho scoffed softly. "Sir, this is absurd. A waitress from a greasy spoon? This is a distraction. A trick. Our security has swept this entire building twice. It is clean." He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed in systems, in protocols, in the infallibility of his own preparations. To him, this woman was a glitch, a random variable to be dismissed and deleted. He looked at her with open contempt, his eyes flicking over her stained apron, her full figure, her unkempt hair. She was nothing, a nobody, and nobodies did not have access to information that could topple empires. Kaito, however, was still watching her face. He was a man who understood that the greatest threats often came not from the expected places, but from the overlooked, the underestimated. He saw the raw, unscripted terror in her eyes, and he contrasted it with the smooth, practiced disdain on his lieutenant's face. He had built his entire life on trusting his instincts, and right now, every instinct he had was screaming at him that the real danger was not this woman, but the possibility that she was telling the truth. The decision had to be made in a heartbeat. Around them, the guests were murmuring, a ripple of confusion, and alarm spreading through the pews. The organist, poised at his console, looked toward the altar for a signal, his hands hovering over the keys. Jin-ho pressed forward again, his voice a low, urgent hiss meant only for Kaido. Sir, the parks are watching. Your bride is watching. Any sign of weakness now, it will destroy the truce before it even begins. We must proceed. Get her out of here, weakness. The word hung in the air. For a man like Kaido, the appearance of strength was everything. To be seen reacting to the hysterical claims of a stranger was a public loss of face. It would make him look foolish, paranoid. It would give his new Korean allies and his old enemies a reason to doubt his control. For a moment, his jaw tightened. He could have her thrown out. He could let the wedding proceed, trusting in his security, in the logic that told him this was impossible. He could choose pride. But then he looked down at Delilah's hand, still clutching his sleeve. He saw the grease under her fingernails, the worn-out fabric of her uniform. This was not a woman who belonged in his world. She had nothing to gain from this. No status, no power, no money. There was no angle he could see, no intricate play for leverage. There was only the stark, simple truth of her terror. And in that moment, he made a choice that went against every rule of his carefully constructed life. He chose to trust a complete stranger over his own trusted lieutenant. He looked at Delilah, a long, unreadable gaze, and then he gave a slight nod, not to her, but to himself. He turned to his men. Get everyone out, he said, his voice calm but absolute. Now, Jin-ho's eyes widened in disbelief. Sir? You heard me, Kaido said, his voice hardening into steel. Clear the building. Quietly if you can. But quickly, he then turned to Minasio, his bride, whose face was a portrait of confusion and fear. He spoke to her in a softer tone, in a language Delilah did not understand, and placed a reassuring hand on her arm before guiding her toward a side exit. The guards moved with swift, brutal efficiency. Whispers turned to panicked questions as elegantly dressed men and women were hustled from their pews and herded toward the doors. Kaido never let go of Delilah's arm. He pulled her along with him, a strange tableau of the impeccably dressed groom and the disheveled waitress, moving as one through the chaos he had just unleashed. They were almost at the main entrance, the fresh air of the street just ahead, when the organist, confused by the commotion and trying to restore order, made a fatal mistake. He thought a triumphant swell of music might calm the crowd. His fingers descended onto the keys, and the first chord of the wedding march boomed through the cathedral. They were thrown forward by the force of the blast. A deafening roar tore through the air, and the beautiful stained glass windows behind them exploded inward in a shower of colored shrapnel. The ground shook violently, and a wave of heat and pressure washed over them, so intense it stole the breath from their lungs. Kaido reacted with pure instinct. He twisted his body, pulling Delilah and Minasio behind him, shielding them with his own frame as the cathedral's heavy oak doors were ripped from their hinges and sent flying across the street. Stone and plaster rained down around them, and the air filled with a thick, choking dust that smelled of cordite and burning flowers. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of falling debris and the high-pitched ringing in their ears. Then the screaming started. Kaido slowly straightened up, his ears still ringing. He was covered in dust, a cut bleeding freely on his temple, but he was alive. He looked behind him. Minasio was on the ground, sobbing in terror but unharmed. And Delilah was staring back at the place where the altar had been, her eyes wide with shock. The entire front of the church was gone, replaced by a gaping, smoking maw. The roof had collapsed. The pews were a tangle of splintered wood and fire. He looked from the devastation back to Delilah. He saw the woman in the faded pink dress, her face smudged with soot, her body trembling uncontrollably. She had not been a distraction. She had not been a trick. She was the only reason he was not a mangled corpse under a pile of sanctified rubble. His men were already swarming, creating a perimeter, pulling black sedans to the curb. Jin-ho was shouting orders, his face pale and tight with a mixture of shock and fury. But Kaido's world had narrowed to the woman standing before him. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was surprisingly gentle. Her knees buckled, and he caught her, holding her steady. "You are safe," he said, the words feeling inadequate. He looked into her eyes and saw not the face of a hysterical stranger, but the face of his savior. The chaos of sirens and shouting faded into the background. In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his wedding and the dawn of a new war, Kaido Ishikawa felt a sensation he had not allowed himself to feel in decades, a profound, unnerving sense of gratitude. He guided her toward one of the waiting cars, his hand never leaving her, a silent promise of protection being made amidst the ruins. The car moved silently through the city streets, a bubble of quiet steel and tinted glass cutting through the afternoon traffic. Delilah sat on the soft leather seat, staring at her own hands, which were still trembling in her lap. She was aware of Kaido sitting beside her, a still and imposing presence. He had a handkerchief pressed to the cut on his temple, the white linen a stark contrast to the dark, drying blood. They had left Minnesio with her own family's security detail after a tense, whispered exchange between Kaido and her father. Now it was just the two of them and a driver, heading to a destination she did not know. They pulled into the subterranean garage of a sleek, anonymous glass tower and were escorted up to a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city. The space was minimalist and severe, all clean lines, dark wood, and glass, with a panoramic view of the skyline. It felt as cold and controlled as the man himself. A silent man in a suit brought a glass of water and a first aid kit. Kaido dismissed him with a nod, and then turned his full attention to Delilah. He sat across from her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the coiled energy he radiated. "I owe you my life," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered in the same, even tone he might use to close a business deal. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Omit nothing," and so, she did. She told him about her shift at the diner, the long hours, the ache in her feet. She described the two men in the corner booth, the way they spoke, the words she had overheard. She told him about her fear, her indecision, and the final, overwhelming impulse that had sent her running to the church. She explained it all in a low, steady voice, the initial shock giving way to a strange, exhausted calm. She did not embellish or dramatize. She just told him the simple, unbelievable truth. Kaido listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He was processing every detail, every hesitation, every word. He was a man accustomed to lies and half-truths, to narratives crafted for personal gain. Delilah's story was the opposite of that. It was messy, simple, and devoid of any self-interest. It was the story of a good person who had done a brave thing for no other reason than it was the right thing to do. When she finished, a long silence settled between them. "You did this," he said finally, "knowing who I am?" Delilah shook her head. "I saw your picture in the paper once. I knew you were important. I didn't know anything else. It didn't matter. They were going to kill you. They were going to kill everyone." Her gaze drifted to the window, to the sprawling city below. I couldn't live with myself if I did nothing. Here is what you need to understand about a man like Kaido Ishikawa. His world was built on transactions. Loyalty was bought, fear was leveraged, and respect was earned through strength. The concept of a purely altruistic act, especially one performed at such personal risk by a powerless stranger, was utterly foreign to him. It was a variable he could not compute, a debt he did not know how to repay. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the stained apron and the tired eyes. He saw a core of integrity that was rarer and more valuable than anything he owned. While Kaido and Delilah sat in the sterile quiet of the penthouse, his organization was moving with ruthless efficiency. His most trusted captain, an older man named Tanaka, was overseeing the investigation. Tanaka was a man of the old school, loyal to the point of fanaticism, and he moved through the city's underworld like a ghost. He did not trust the police to find the truth. He would find it himself. The first break came from a low-level informant who recognized Delilah's description of the man with the nervous tic. He was a freelancer, a demolitions man known for taking high-risk jobs. A few hours of persuasive questioning in a warehouse by the docks revealed who had hired him, a mid-level fixer for the Park family, the Koreans. On the surface, it was exactly as the bombers had intended it to look. A Korean betrayal, an act of war disguised as an act of peace. It was the perfect pretext for Kaido to retaliate with overwhelming force, to shatter the truce and absorb the Park's territory. Many of his own captains were urging him to do just that. The call for blood was immediate and loud. But Kaido was not convinced. The play was too clean, too obvious. It felt wrong. He had instructed Tanaka to dig deeper, to ignore the easy answer, and find the hard one. The key, Tanaka knew, was the second man, the impassive one who had given the orders. His description was vague, but one detail from Delilah stuck out, a small, crescent-shaped scar on his left wrist, visible only when he reached for his wallet. Tanaka knew that scar. He had seen it 100 times. It belonged to Jinho, Kaido's own sharp-faced lieutenant. The man who had been so eager to dismiss Delilah, to push the wedding forward, to get Kaido to the altar on time. The betrayal was not from the outside. It came from within his own house. Tanaka made the call to Kaido, his voice heavy. The conversation was short, the words precise. When Kaido hung up the phone, the cold mask of his composure had cracked ever so slightly. A flicker of something ancient and dangerous burned in his eyes. He now understood. Jinho had been making his own play, conspiring with a rogue faction of the Parks. They didn't want peace, they wanted chaos. By killing Kaido and his bride at the wedding, they would ignite a war that would consume both families, allowing them to rise from the ashes and seize control. It was a bold, treacherous plan. And it would have worked if not for a waitress with sore feet and a conscience. He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights beginning to glitter in the twilight. He had been betrayed by a man he had trusted like a brother. And he had been saved by a woman he had never met. The irony was as sharp and cold as a blade. The confrontation did not happen in a boardroom or an office. Kaido summoned Jinho to a traditional Japanese garden on the roof of another of his properties, a place of raked sand, carefully placed stones, and a single, ancient bonsai tree. The air was cool, the city a distant hum below. It was a place designed for contemplation, for serenity. Tonight, it was an execution chamber. Jinho arrived, his expression a careful mixture of concern and deference. "Sir," he began, bowing slightly. "Tanaka-san has reported the Koreans are responsible. My deepest apologies for the security failure. I take full." Kaido cut him off, not with a word, but with a look. He was standing by the bonsai tree, meticulously trimming a single leaf with a pair of small, silver shears. "The scar on your wrist, Jinho," Kaido said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "How did you get it?"
Jinho froze.
The blood drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, pale color. He instinctively tried to cover his left wrist with his right hand. "Sir, an accident in my youth." "It is nothing, is it?" Kaido set the shears down with a soft click. "Tanaka seems to think it is something. The woman, the waitress, she saw it. She described it perfectly." The carefully constructed world around Jinho collapsed in that single moment. There was no escape. No denial was possible. His ambition, his treachery, it was all laid bare by the memory of a woman he had dismissed as nothing. He had underestimated the one person he should have feared the most, the honest witness. A long, terrible silence stretched between them. Jinho's composure crumbled, replaced by a desperate, animal fear. He fell to his knees. "Sir, please. I was misguided. They promised you my seat." Kaido finished for him, his voice devoid of all emotion. "And you were willing to burn down our entire world to claim it.
You would have killed me.
You would have killed an innocent woman. You would have sent hundreds of our brothers to their deaths in a war you created." He walked slowly toward the kneeling man. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The stillness that surrounded him was more terrifying than any shout. "You dishonored yourself. You dishonored me. You dishonored our family." Kaido stopped directly in front of Jinho. What happened next was quiet, swift, and absolute. Tanaka and two other men stepped out of the shadows. There were no pleas, no screams. There was only the quiet fulfillment of a code as old as the stones in the garden. Justice, in their world, was not about courts or laws. It was about balance. And the balance had been restored. Kaido never looked back. He walked away, leaving the garden to his men, his face an unreadable mask once more. His only thought was of the woman waiting for him back in the penthouse, the woman who had unknowingly become the fulcrum upon which his entire life had turned. When Kaido returned to the penthouse, the sky outside was dark, bruised with the first shades of night. He found Delilah not in the vast living area, but in the kitchen. She had found coffee and had made a pot, the simple, domestic act a strange counterpoint to the day's violence and luxury. The rich, warm smell filled the sterile space, making it feel, for the first time, like a home. She had taken off her ruined apron and folded it neatly on a countertop. She looked up as he entered, her expression not of fear, but of a quiet, weary resignation. She held out a mug for him. "I figured you might need this," she said. He took it, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into his cold hands. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft hum of the city far below. "It's done," he said finally. He did not offer details, and she did not ask for them. She understood enough. "You are no longer in danger. The man who planned this will not harm anyone ever again." "Good," she said softly.
It was all she said.
Kaido looked at the neatly folded apron on the counter. The stains, the worn fabric, the symbol of her life's struggle. He had seen more wealth and power than most men could dream of, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was looking at an object of profound honor. "You will not be returning to the diner," he stated. "You cannot go back to your old life. My enemies, and what remains of Jinho's allies, will know who you are. They will see you as a threat, or as a tool to get to me." Delilah's shoulders slumped slightly. "So, what happens to me?" "You will be protected," he said. "I will give you a new life. A new home, anywhere you want. Money, security, whatever you need. It is the smallest part of the debt I owe you." She looked at him then, her gaze direct and searching. "I don't want your money, Mr. Ishikawa, Kaido," he corrected her gently. "My name is Kaido, Kaido," she repeated. "I don't want to be a debt you have to pay. I just wanted to go home." A deep ache resonated in her words. The ache of an ordinary person swept up in an extraordinary storm, who wanted nothing more than the simple safety of the world she knew. Kaido understood. He was offering her a gilded cage, and she was asking for freedom. "Your old home is not safe," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "But I will give you a new one. Not a cage. A sanctuary. I promise you." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pick up the folded apron. He held it in his hands, as if it were a priceless artifact. "You will not need this anymore," he said. "Unless you want to," and in that quiet moment, in a kitchen high above the city, something shifted between them. It was not just gratitude, and it was not yet love. It was a profound and powerful recognition, a bond forged in fire and sealed with a promise. 3 months passed. The city healed from the brief, violent tremor that had shaken its underworld. The truce with the Park family, miraculously, was salvaged. Kaido, with a ruthlessness that stunned his rivals, had consolidated his power, purging the disloyal and rewarding the faithful. The story of the wedding bombing became a dark legend, whispered in back rooms, its true details known only to a handful of people. And Delilah was gone. She had vanished from her old life as if she had never existed. Her apartment was empty, her job at the diner filled by another tired girl. To the world, she was simply a loose end that had been tied up. The truth was quieter and far kinder. On a small, sun-drenched street in a coastal town hundreds of miles away, a new cafe had opened. It was called The Morning Glory. It was a bright, airy space that smelled of fresh coffee and baking bread. Behind the counter was Delilah. She was not wearing a uniform, but a simple dress, her hair tied back. She moved with a lightness and ease that had been absent before, her smile genuine and frequent. She knew every regular by name. Her life was calm, simple, and her own. Kaido had kept his promise. He had given her the deed to the building, a business account with more money than she had ever seen, and a new identity. More than that, he had given her his most trusted man, Tanaka, who now lived in a small house down the street, a silent, watchful guardian posing as a retired fisherman. One crisp autumn afternoon, the bell above the cafe door chimed. Delilah looked up from the cup she was polishing and her breath caught in her throat.
Kaido stood there.
He was not wearing a suit, but simple trousers and a dark sweater. He looked younger, less severe. The immense weight he carried seemingly lifted for a moment. He walked to the counter and sat on one of the stools. "I was told the coffee here is the best on the coast," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Delilah found her voice. "It's decent," she said, her heart beating a little faster. She poured him a cup, her hand steady, and placed it in front of him. They sat in a comfortable silence, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window, illuminating the space between them. There were no bodyguards, no pretense, no danger. There was only a man and a woman, sharing a cup of coffee. He had saved her from a life of poverty, and she had saved him from death. The debt was balanced. But what was growing between them was something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with debts or promises. It was the quiet, steady beginning of a new story, the story of what comes after. What do you think is the true meaning of courage? Is it facing down a powerful enemy, or is it the quiet decision to do the right thing, no matter the cost? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more. We will see you in the next one.